All right, thank you, everyone. Thank you very much. I mean, I'd like to begin by expressing my sincerest thanks to the conference organisers. This is wonderful. It's so lovely to be still a part of this and having the conference go ahead, of course. And it's my sincerest hope that I can actually be there at some point, of course. But for the moment, we have to tolerate these virtual conferences. So I hope, of course, that the talk here is of some interest and some appeal to the audience members. I'm presenting recent research and actually emerging research, a field that's growing over the last few years within vocabulary, is to look at vocabulary within fluency. And this is the background to this to begin with. And I'll take you through some new results and new research, and then point you to some publications that this work is currently presented in. Okay, so we'll give some background first, but as I say, this is a new area of investigation. So conventionally, of course, we all know that, well, when we speak, of course, we use words, and the words that we choose, of course, have some impact on the fluency, but of course, it's something that we're constantly doing. We're trying to speak and choose, formulate, present the words that we use. And there are various studies that look at this, both subjectively and objectively. This study looks at an objective series of studies that look at measurements of how vocabulary knowledge and fluent speech relate. And our research relates to papers based from Nivea de Jong and her earlier papers as well. You can see that there are other related papers that look at this, but these later papers look at this from a subjective approach. In other words, they use raters, much in the same way as you would expect, for example, by examiners listening to students in a class, or IELTS examiners, they'll give a score. Our approach doesn't use that. We're using independent measures, which we'll show as we approach. As far as fluency goes, there are two definitions rather, a broad and a narrow. We're using the narrow here, and narrow is one that refers to the extent to which we can actually quantify, look at aspects of fluency. And so Tava Colley is a reasonably big name in this field, where she's looked at the facility to understand fluency according to filled or unfilled pauses, for example, repetitions and repairs, amongst others. And these are measured according to microseconds. In the broader sense, we can see that fluency is important. For example, if we look at the CEFR and their ratings, for example, you'll be able to see through here that we have C2, that expert users are considered to be able to speak spontaneously, very fluently. B2, or independent users, perhaps more at the intermediate level, have a degree of fluency, and there's a degree of spontaneity. And then A2, basic users, make themselves understood in short contributions, even though pauses, false starts, and reformulations are very evident. And these are also diagnostic elements that we would expect from fluency. So, of course, the CEFR uses this. Other measures use this, such as TOEFL, IELTS, and so on. And what's broadly lacking, of course, is the facility to try and describe these in terms of objective measures. And what our research ultimately aims to do is try to compare the two. But as I've said, of course, we have this broad element, this narrow element, and we have these different definitions, of course. Breakdown, how often speech breaks down, or the number of pauses that is independently counted. Speed fluency, the rate of speech, and then speed also that's counted according to pauses and articulation rate. Repair fluency, which refers to the number of times a speaker repairs speech. Okay, and these are all counted. Okay, I realize this is a lot of detail that I'm skipping over, but I want to get to the research study itself. But before that, we also have vocabulary, and in its broadest sense, vocabulary is also broken down into different categories, and within the field, broadly, we have these two distinctions of receptive and productive. Receptive vocabulary relates to that we understand, that we can hear vocabulary, we hear that receptively, or we read it, of course. And this is receptive, conventionally known as that, or productive, and those that we produce by either writing or speaking, of course, hopefully you're all listening receptively, and I'm here producing, of course, as we go. There are measures of receptive vocabulary, and this is one, this particular example here. This is a receptive test. It gives words that may or may not exist. We look at the word until, and we're asked to say, does this word exist in English? If we think it does, we click the smiley face. If we think it doesn't, we click the non-smiley face. And what this test does is it counts for knowledge of up to 5,000 words. Lots of vocabulary studies will organize vocabulary knowledge according to frequency lists, and the frequency lists are broken down per 1,000 of common words, or commonly used words from corpora. And what this particular test does, XLEX, is it measures the number of correctly identified false words. If participants, when taking this test, they identify until as incorrect, of course, it's not a real word, for example, they'll click here, and there's no error count. Okay. With XLEX, you get a score, and then the score, of course, generally speaking, broadly relates to one's receptive vocabulary knowledge. So in earlier fluency studies, Nivea de Jong and colleagues have looked at the relation between X and YLEX. YLEX covers the 5,000 to 10,000 word level. So of course, this test combined covers from 0 to 10,000 words. And they've found that aspects of fluency do indeed relate to vocabulary knowledge. Mirope and Munoz have done the same thing. They've looked at oral fluency with both X and YLEX, and they've found a moderately strong correlation there too. Okay. What's lacking, I think, or broadly what's lacking, of course, are studies that look at vocabulary and productive knowledge. And for us, this is quite surprising because, of course, when you're speaking with aspects of fluency, you're also producing those words. And so we felt that this was something that needed examining further. Nivea de Jong has looked at this in a broader study, but the intention wasn't really only to look at vocabulary knowledge. It was also to look at other aspects of knowledge, such as grammatical knowledge, for example, and other aspects of proficiency. But with the productive vocabulary levels test, which I'll talk about shortly, she found a negatively but significant correlation. Colleagues had also measured this with LEX 30, and they'd found, again, here, a moderate but significant correlation. So those two tests that we mentioned, LEX 30 and the PVLT, operate very differently. LEX 30 is a test or task that is based on word associations. We have the word attack, and then participants are asked to respond with any 4 words that they can think of in response to this. So for attack, you might present, I don't know, let's think defend, Iraq, missile, for example, and so on and so forth. And the responses to these can amount up to 120. And the way that this is evaluated is that responses that are not within that first 1,000 frequency band are considered infrequent and therefore judged as scoring items to LEX 30. The test has its benefits in as much as even lower level learners can take this test and we can still produce a score. Okay. Another example of a productive vocabulary test is the productive vocabulary levels test. And this one here is perhaps slightly more challenging for lower level learners. And this is the one that showed significant correlations in Nivea de Jong's earlier study, but this one here does not only, we feel, measure vocabulary knowledge, it also measures aspects of grammar, syntax, semantics. Okay. So, for example, here we can see an example question 1. I'm glad we had this op to talk. The answer here is opportunity. But the issue with this test is, of course, we need to know the words that go with opportunity in order to respond. And so we feel that this particular test is more challenging for those students that lack that additional knowledge that may not immediately go with vocabulary knowledge. But the point of showing you these two is to suggest that, for example, one test might be more suitable for lower level learners, one test might be more suitable for more advanced level learners. Okay. So hopefully comfortably, that brings me to why we would want to look at this in this study. So we wanted to explore vocabulary and fluency measures and the relationships between them. We didn't have advanced level learners as those earlier studies did. We had access to pre-intermediate level learners, so we thought we should choose a test appropriately. Another element that has not been looked at is vocabulary use. And this might also sound a little bit strange, but what we wanted to do was actually look at the vocabulary that was actually produced in our speaking tasks, not in the vocabulary task, but in the speaking task, and to see if there was any relationship between the vocabulary used in the speaking task and the vocabulary scores that came from our vocabulary tests or tasks. And we thought that was quite an obvious thing to do as well. So this leads us to our research question. And our question here is, to what extent can vocabulary use, can vocabulary knowledge predict aspects of fluency and use? Hopefully that makes sense to you. Our participants were 30 first language Japanese undergraduate students, my poor students, who are English second language users and learners. And we hit them with a battery of tests. We gave them the XLEX task, you remember from before, where they had a yes/no question task. Here their scores are reasonably good, you can see, because the upper score, maximum score on that test is 5,000. The mean age was 19, and there was 16 males and 14 females, so reasonably well divided between the two gender groups. Okay, so what speaking tasks did we give? I haven't included these in this presentation, but hopefully I can explain them. But Nivea de Jong, in two earlier papers, used 3 different speaking tasks. And the idea being that if you can spread the complexity, the level of complexity across the different speaking tasks, then you might have a representative interpretation of someone speaking. So we have a formal descriptive, a formal persuasive, and an informal persuasive. And what these mean is, for example, the formal persuasive is you're in a school and there's a school meeting. Should we have a casino put next to the school, for example? And students are given 2 minutes to respond to this task. The 3 tasks are all broadly similar, where they're presented with a task on a personal computer. They're asked to imagine speaking for the situation presented. They're given 30 seconds within which to prepare a response, and they respond within 2 minutes. And this is something that has been used broadly and widely within speaking and fluency studies, that they're given time to prepare. And this is based on suggestions from Segalovitz and others, and that they're given multiple tasks, of course, so we can take the average. And of course, we can't suggest that their speaking has been skewed by one task over another. Okay. We also presented picture naming tasks. Again, I'm not really going to talk too much about this, and I'm not going to present this, but this is based on this elicits understandings of lexical retrieval speed and speed of articulation. What is presented is an image of a particularly well-known item, such as a giraffe or a house. Students are given, or participants are given, preparation time. They're given all of these different images to begin with, and then they're presented with these items, and the measurements measure how quickly they're able to retrieve the item and how quickly they're able to produce the item, and this measures those two there. Okay, so of course, XLEX, I mentioned before, we gave them this. Hopefully that made sense to you before. We also gave them the Lex 30 task. Lex 30 asks for them to respond with up to 4 responses for those 30 cues. Okay. All right, so I think hopefully I'm doing 5 minutes left, haven't I? Doing okay for time. So the descriptive statistics are these. I probably shouldn't spend too much time on these. I don't think this demands too much of our attention. And the descriptive test results here for the vocabulary variables as well, very similarly, not unusual, but hopefully this is of some interest. Okay, our results show that the Lex 30 score does indeed relate to one of our aspects of fluency. So this means, of course, the number of silent pauses per second was negatively correlated to Lex 30. So for our Japanese learners, the smaller number of silent pauses per second related to a higher Lex 30 score. And I think intuitive, that probably makes sense. The more advanced learners paused fewer times. Okay. And this is something that I think is very, very encouraging, because of course what this seems to do is to suggest that Lex 30 is indeed appropriate for those learners at those levels. Okay, I'm not going to focus on these for purposes of time, but I do also want to mention this, and this is something that's also new for this area of research, is that we also wanted to look at the relationship between productive vocabulary knowledge and vocabulary use. So as I mentioned before, Lex 30, we have this task, a written-based task, and uses writing to elicit vocabulary knowledge. And there is a bit of a mismatch here. Of course, I think a very good question might be, well, you've used Lex 30 as a written task to compare that with a spoken task, and do the two skills relate? And we wanted to evaluate this further, and not completely, of course. There are studies that have looked at Lex 30 written as well as spoken, and they've shown that they do significantly correlate, but only moderately. What we wanted to do is process the data using a spoken word list. And I'm not sure if you're familiar, but if you're not, I do recommend it, highly recommend it. This is a wonderful paper about the academic spoken word list. And these authors, Dang et al., state that there's a clear-cut difference between the linguistic features of academic speech and academic writing. And so they themselves are acknowledging that, of course, written-based corpora should consider vocabulary differently compared to spoken corpora. So they developed the academic spoken word list, and the idea, of course, being that it represented as closely as possible the academic speech for English for academic purpose learners from a broad range of academic disciplines. Okay. So what we did was we looked at the fluency tasks, the speaking tasks, and we compared those with the Lex 30 scores. And all of these measures were evaluated, or rather processed, using the academic spoken word list. And what we found was these two significant, again, not very strong, moderately strong correlations, or significant correlations, between level 2 words and level 0. Level 0 means not in the list, and Lex 30 has been broken down accordingly. We believe that most of our learners were using level 2 words, and these are words that are likely to exist at the second 1,000 frequency band, so they're moderately commonly used. And so what this suggests is, of course, that we probably need to help learners with the level 1, level 3, level 4 words, potentially to improve their fluency, because what they're relying on is this level 2 frequency band in order to produce words in speaking tasks. Okay, and that's probably what you would expect of this level of learner. Okay, I have a minute left. I hope I can go a little bit over, but the study supports the relationships between vocabulary knowledge and fluency. Generally speaking, higher vocabulary scores correlated negatively and significantly with silent pause, which is probably what you would expect. Lex 30 does appear to relate to vocabulary used. Of course, we think there might be an issue with the number of participants we've got, but this is encouraging. Does this study show that we've found the tools that relate to our level of pre-intermediate learners? Maybe. Does this study show that Lex 30 taps vocabulary used? Well, yes, possibly, but the number of participants are very, very low. We looked at automaticity, and we showed to some extent that there were relationships there. Okay. In future studies, we hope to use spoken corpora. We'll use spoken productive vocabulary knowledge tests, which we didn't use here. We want to use concurrent productive vocabulary knowledge tests to explore different knowledge relationships, for example, such as appropriateness, communicative content, and so on. We'd also like to look at different L1 backgrounds and different levels. And we're also interested in looking at L1 pausing data, for example. We did actually run these tests with all of our learners in Japanese. And we think that might be quite interesting as well. Okay, here are some references. I would love to point you all to this particular reference. This is where this study is being shown. We had this book published last year. We're very happy about that. Actually, this date is wrong. This is 2020, but language teaching research, we've also got another study. We're looking at that too. Thank you very much.